So what I wanted to do before we start is kind of give a background of how you get to the Pilgrims, because it really is a theological thing that's driving everything that goes on. So if you go back to before Henry VIII, the church in England was the Roman Catholic Church. Henry VIII was even well known. He was the defender of the faith, was the title that was given to him by the Pope because he was such a devout Roman Catholic, and he wrote books defending Roman Catholicism. But then he doesn't have a male heir. And if you remember before that, there had been like 100 years of war, the 100 Years' War that was between the House of York and the House of Lancaster, and there had been battles over succession for a long time. So Henry VIII is going, if I don't have a male heir, England's going to break out into war again. So he says, I have to get divorced. He comes up with all kinds of excuses. The Pope says no, he won't annul the marriage. So Henry VIII says, we'll no longer be Roman Catholic. But they're Roman Catholic in everything except for having the Pope. And that's important to recognize. Henry VIII isn't trying to change the doctrine of the church or anything. All he's trying to do is say, I want the authority to be divorced, so I'll become the Pope of England. And that's where you get the start of the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. After all that, he dies. At the same time that these things are going on the continent, you're getting the Reformation started, you have Luther, but you have a lot of things stirring up that Henry VIII was fighting against before he split the church off. Henry VIII dies, and his son Edward becomes king. And he's 10 when he becomes king, and he's king for 6 years. But he actively tries to reform the doctrine to make the doctrine Protestant. So under Henry VIII, it's Roman Catholic doctrine with the king as the head of the church. Under Edward, it's Reformed doctrine, more Reformed. It would certainly be what we would call Calvinistic, is what he was pushing for, but still he would be the head of the church as king. And so he ends up dying at the age of 16. He wants to appoint a Protestant to be his successor, so he appoints Lady Jane Grey, but Mary, who's called Bloody Mary for good reason, she deposes her after 9 days, and she becomes queen. And then she turns the church back to be under the Pope, and it goes all back to Roman Catholic doctrine. She reigns for, I think it's 6 years, and she's very active in that reign to stop any doctrinal movement, any of the Protestant movement coming into England. This is where you get the first connection to the Pilgrims, is because she's persecuting those who are teaching non-Roman Catholic doctrine, the London Underground Church starts. The London Underground Church was a small group, but at one point it reached about 1,000 people, which the population of London at that time was about 100,000, so it's about 1% of the people. And this is also how you get connection to the Reformers. Even though it's a small number, the Queen is so concerned about them that she ends up sending a spy in that finds out where they're meeting, and then once they find out where they're meeting, they go and they arrest the pastor and they put him to death. Queen Mary, Bloody Mary, she dies, and Queen Elizabeth becomes queen. Queen Elizabeth follows her father's view, which is Henry VIII, which is the church should be largely Roman Catholic, but she should be the head of the church. Whenever you think of the Virgin Queen, the reason she was the Virgin Queen is because what would happen if she got married? The king would rule, not her. So her big thing was power for herself. That's why she was a virgin queen. It doesn't mean she was chaste. She almost certainly wasn't a virgin. What she was is a celibate queen. She wouldn't get married because as soon as she got married, she loses power. She didn't want to lose power in the state. She didn't want to lose power in the church. About Elizabeth I, it was all about power. She wanted power. And she didn't even really care about what happened in the next generation. She wanted power in her generation. So she wants to go back to there, but she starts by going to what Edward did, and so she brings into the church this idea of Reformed doctrine, and then she tries to walk it back. Well, you can tell what's going to be going on with all the people that are going to church in this. They're Roman Catholic with the king as the Pope, they're then Roman Catholic with the Pope as the Pope, then they're Protestant, and then they're not Protestant, and so there's all kinds of turmoil. And out of this comes the idea that maybe the state shouldn't be over the church. When we think of the Pilgrims, the big idea that they end up changing the world with is very much congregationalism. The idea that a congregation has authority over itself, that the ecclesiastic magistrate is next to the civil magistrate is not above the ecclesiastic magistrate. And that's a really big idea. Henry VIII says, "I'm now the Pope," and everybody goes, "Yes, sir." And then Edward says, "Be reformed," and then they all become reformed. Then Bloody Mary comes in. And so as the civil magistrates flopping back and forth, going all over the place, the people are getting tired of it and saying maybe the civil magistrate shouldn't be over the ecclesiastical magistrate. Maybe they shouldn't be telling us what to believe. And so that's what the London Underground Church is, that a lot more people start to come out where there's all this thrashing around, especially when Elizabeth requires people to start to wear vestments, because all of a sudden they're saying that your attire, and they're making this separation between the secular and the sacred. And as they make this separation to have this priesthood be like the nobility, she wanted a separate, distinct group of people that would be following her, because again, she's all about power. And so she's requiring them to identify and separate themselves from the people. And a lot of the people said, we're not going to wear the long robes with the things going down. And so they go to the underground church. So Robert Brown, he starts and writes a book. He's actually north of London, but he writes a book that basically says you shouldn't wait. The title is something like, "Don't Wait for Reformation for Any." And his point is, your reformation should not be based on what the civil magistrate's doing. What you should do is reform the church based on what the Word of God says. Now, what's interesting about the Brownist movement, and even when the Pilgrims came over here, they called it the Brownist emigration, because they're seeing it as the Brownist movement, but Brown only followed the movement for maybe 6 years. And then he ends up splitting off a church because it was illegal, and he takes them to the Netherlands. Everybody keeps going to the Netherlands because there isn't persecution there, even though they have a national religion too. But they don't enforce it to force you into it like other countries were. When Robert Brown leads the people over there, they get into a big fight. Not the first time. You have a group of people that decide to separate from other people. They're all separating for different reasons. They all end up fighting, and it disintegrates. And Brown basically goes, forget it. And he goes back and becomes an Anglican priest. And he becomes back in the Church of England. And he actually then starts to write things that counter what he was writing before. So everybody's calling him a rebellion to the cause he started. But he's writing things saying you're all schismatic. There's two other men that end up taking his place and leading the London Underground Church. They both end up getting put to death by Queen Elizabeth. And so then somebody else rises up, and again, you get the movement out that moving back to Netherlands. And this is where John Robinson comes on the scene. He comes on after, I think it's Barrow, and I'm drawing a blank on the other name. But after they both get put to death, about 4 people replace them, and Ainsworth, and they end up moving, and there ends up being 3 major congregations in the Netherlands. But this kind of gives the background of what's going on. You can see the threat that the state saw, even for the small number of people. And that's one of the things that really struck me over this last year is, the government says shut down. This is Erastianism. This is what the whole Pilgrim movement was about, the Separatist movement was about, is who has the right to command the church? Is it the civil magistrate, or does the church have its own authority given to it by Christ, because Christ is the head and the cornerstone of the church? And now we have the same thing happening now, where basically the king, the president says, shut down, and all churches all over the country shut down. We're returning back to where we were 400 years ago, back to where we were before the Pilgrims came. And the Pilgrims come, when you think about it, right, it looks like they're losers, but go back 100 years, and churches would say the civil magistrate doesn't have any right to speak to you at all. That's our founding documents of the country, the freedom of religion and all that stuff. That comes from the idea that the king is not over the church. And this is what we're losing, and this is what we should remember about the Pilgrims. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and share it with your friends. You can also visit www.discerninghistory.com for more videos and other resources.